Hello and a very warm welcome to this latest edition of Talking Germany. And my guest today is a man who has been at the forefront of one of the most important battles currently being fought in the world of business and politics, and that is the battle against corruption. And that man is Peter Eigen. Here he is now. Thank you very, very much for joining us here today, Peter Eigen, on Talking Germany.
Thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here.
Lovely, wonderful. Now, Peter Eigen was the founder of Transparency International, which has its headquarters right here in Berlin and plays a central role in putting the spotlight on corporate and government corruption worldwide. So, my first question for Peter Eigen is there a general, overall, universal definition of what corruption is that applies worldwide?
Not really.
Oh.
Many people have different definitions. We at Transparency International, we used to define corruption as the abuse of public power for personal gain. But we have changed this because we also would like to cover private corruption, and therefore we call it now the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain.
The abuse of entrusted power for personal gain.
We like to distinguish it from murder, from theft, from organized crime, from drug trafficking. There has to be an element of special trusted position which somebody has, like a civil servant or a member of parliament. And that has to be abused for not only the gain of the person who is involved, but also possibly for others, like family members and so on. But it is a very general definition, and therefore we expect that our national chapters of Transparency International, and we have more than 100 chapters all over the world, that they define corruption in accordance with their reality, because we want this to be a functional, living term, and therefore I think we have in our movement differences, slight differences, where people look, for instance, at certain traditions of gift giving or of mutual support as quite normal, while others might call it corruption. So I think this is important to recognize this distinction.
OK, so a very nuanced definition of what corruption is or can be in different parts of the world. Something very concrete. When was the first time in your life that you actually experienced corruption firsthand, with your own eyes?
Well, it's very hard to remember. I mean, I can imagine that I have seen situations where somebody gave a ticket person at the theater a little gift to be allowed to get a better seat, or things like this, you know, in my life. I can imagine that some of the gifts which, for instance, my father received, who was a manager in a business company, every Christmas, that they were given to him with the intention to get contracts or other benefits from it. So I think corruption has so many different faces that I really didn't recognize it as a terrible thing which it is until I was with the World Bank, where I saw that in particular the poor people of the world are suffering most from corruption.
Before we talk a little bit more about corruption and so on, Peter Eigen, I'd like to go back to your very early days, to Augsburg, the city where you were born. You were born there in 1938. What were your earliest memories?
I think my earliest memories start only in Berlin, where my father had moved when I was 4 years old or so. Before then, it was like a dream. But in Berlin, I have very vivid memories of our beautiful garden in Frohnau, of visits in unter den Linden, and from there we moved to Prague, and I have good memories of this time because there also we had a beautiful, huge garden. And then from then on, I think I was always a child of a very friendly family, which treated me very well. That's interesting,
because since the 1960s, one of the things we believe we have learnt about the world is that young people, teenagers, they rebel against their parents. Were you a rebellious young man?
Not really. I mean, I was...
You didn't want to change the world?
I loved my mother. I mean, my mother was just a wonderful person. She saw everywhere. She saw potential and creativity and so on
It's a wonderful thing.
In me and in my 3 siblings. But my father was away for 5 years after the war. And when he came back, he also was a person of great love and respect. So
wow.
in many ways, I felt very comfortable in my family.
Wonderful. Though, let's move on then to you. I think it was in 1968. I think I've got the date right. You went and joined the World Bank, and that's very interesting because I just mentioned the student protests of the 1960s, yeah, in passing, and certainly the people who were out on the streets protesting in 1968, in precisely that year, they would have viewed the organisation you were joining, the World Bank, as the bad guys.
Well, we were protesting ourselves, but we protested in America against the Vietnam War. But I have to admit, the 68 protests here in Germany, I only saw from the distance, because we had left Germany in 1966. I was writing my professorial dissertation for Frankfurt University, but I lived in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And from there I went in to the World Bank. So in many ways I really missed what was happening, in particular here in Berlin, but also in other universities.
But it's interesting that you talk about we were out there protesting against the Vietnam War and what have you, because a very important person in your life, we've heard this already in the report that we've just had, was your first wife, yeah? And the story goes, you just said we to me were protesting, but the story goes is that you were in your World Bank office and your wife was outside protesting against you.
Well, I mean, this was not the only time that this happened. I remember once in Erlangen still, where I lived with Jutta Philippi Eigen for a long time. I was inside a reception in the castle of Erlangen, where the president of the university was receiving the American ambassador. And outside on the Schlossplatz, there were students protesting, and lo and behold, my wife and my daughter were there, my daughter on her arm. And the same thing then happened again in Washington, because much to my chagrin, I was...
Tell us who we're seeing the photo of here. Is that...
This is Jutta. This is my wife, Jutta. You're right.
This was your wife, yeah. Had the...
And she was very, very strong-willed. She had been struggling with her father who was a director at Siemens, about, for instance, nuclear waste and things of this nature. Yeah. But when I was appointed in the World Bank to be the division chief for the countries in Latin America, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and so on, I was trying to do something for the Chilean people. But many people in Washington at the time thought whatever we do for the Chilean people really helps Pinochet, whom I abhorred as much as anybody else did. I mean, we were very close friends of the opposition of Chile, who was living with us in Washington, D.C. So she walked outside the World Bank protesting against the World Bank's policies, which I was driving at the time.
Okay. And it took quite a while, but at some stage you became very disillusioned with what you were doing, and you decided to set up Transparency. You left the World Bank and you decided to set up Transparency International. What do you believe that you have achieved with setting up Transparency International in the last 20 years?
Well, I think when I left the World Bank, most of the countries, including the rich countries like Germany and Great Britain and France, they allowed their exporters and their companies investing outside their borders to bribe. So it was in Germany, it was totally legal for a company like Siemens or Daimler or Bilfinger & Berger to go out and pay a minister, a president, huge amounts of money in order to get big projects, billions of dollars worth of projects. And therefore, I did not get any support from the World Bank when I suggested we have to do something about it, because corruption perverts economic decision making. It is the main reason for the misery and the poverty in many parts of the world. So I said the World Bank has a mandate to do something about poverty, so I want to do something about one of the most important contributing factors to this poverty. And I found out very quickly that the members of the World Bank, including Germany, they believe that corruption is normal in a global economy where you don't have a coherent governance structure. Everybody else was bribing. So they felt we have to do the same thing. And therefore, they more or less fired me at the time in 1990, 91. So what has happened since that time? Since this time, we managed, together with companies who also felt that a corruption-free market is good for them, together with government people, together with other civil society organizations, we managed to change the legal system so that now, for instance, in Germany, foreign bribery is a crime. We have now about 120 companies in Germany which are prosecuted for bribing outside Germany. In the past, until 1999, these companies not only were not prosecuted, they could even go and deduct the bribes they paid from the taxable income. So this scandalous situation we were able to change through our activities. I think we have to recognize that domestic corruption was always a crime in Germany. So if certain companies do not have proper compliance systems for corruption more generally, then this is very risky for them, because under German law they always have been committing a crime.
But how far does this go? I mean, we heard about it in that report, the traditional practice of giving a business partner 2 tickets for a top soccer match. Is that non-compliance, or is that...
I mean, I would say this is a question of judgment of a particular community within which you want to judge this. I mean, for instance, a journalist, I would suggest, should be extremely careful not to accept any great goods and so on, and gifts. But there are other areas where it is very hard to see how you can affect the decision-making of a person by giving them a bottle of champagne or inviting them for lunch or something like that. To the contrary, I think it would probably be seen as pretty stiff, if you don't allow somebody for lunch, if you have initiated a lunch. So in many ways, this is something where one has to use good judgment.
But how bad is then corruption in Germany internally? Because certainly on the Transparency International, on the ranking, Germany is doing quite well. It's in 12th position and is viewed as a relatively clean country. But that report suggests that there's an awful lot of sort of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours going on.
Well, Germany is doing quite well. I mean, there are certain things which should be better in Germany. For instance, access to information legislation is very poor in Germany. We have been struggling for that. The procurement systems in certain jurisdictions are very poor. So in many ways, Germany should do much better. But I think in response to this particular presentation, I would say it is very important to distinguish between domestic corruption and bribing outside Germany. It was a letter which interested me when I started TI, because I felt that the poor people in the world are particularly victimized, that they are helpless. How does say a Kenyan judge or a Kenyan prosecutor or a Kenyan journalist find out whether a president or a minister has accepted by a promoter of a big, say, German company a deposit of tens of millions of dollars in a Liechtenstein account, and then takes the wrong decisions, which ruins the country, for the future. So this distinction is important, but I also think it is important that there are people like this who introduce compliance systems more effectively in German business. But I would say it is not necessarily the small companies which are more vulnerable. In fact, they cannot afford these very fancy compliance organizations which are growing right now like mushrooms, you know. But many of the family-owned companies, for instance, they have a style and a culture and a tradition where they absolutely don't pay any bribes. While the big companies, many of them being prosecuted right now in Germany, they have had no problems at all to go out to Paraguay or to Russia or to Nigeria and pay tens of millions of dollars to the decision makers in these countries in order to buy the wrong decisions.
Well, let's talk about, because I'm interested in how you see Transparency International's record in the 20 years that you've been doing good work, and you've set benchmarks, international benchmarks, without a doubt. You're a very important organisation. But in my own personal, my emotional reaction to all this is that, you know, when I was a very young guy, I would look at a continent like Africa, a continent that I know is very close to your heart, and I assumed that in my lifetime, I was going to see African economies blossoming, flourishing, and many years later, I'm not hopeful about that anymore. And the main reason why I'm not hopeful about that, and I'm not just talking about Africa here, I don't want to just harp on about Africa, is corruption.
I think you are absolutely right, because if you compare countries like South Korea, for instance, with Kenya, you'll see that South Korea, which was at the same level 20, 30 years ago, is now a highly developed country. You know, while in Africa, in Kenya, you still have a large proportion of the people living below the poverty line. You don't have running water, you don't have electricity, you don't have schooling for many children, you don't have health services, and you are absolutely right. It is this deadly impact of grand corruption in particular, because it is these large amounts of money which are being paid to decision makers to pervert economic decision making, to finance huge power dams for hundreds of millions of dollars, which are useless, you know, which have no clients, which have no proper preparation of the environmental impact, which has hundreds of thousands of people being resettled, which has a tremendous impact on future debt service. I mean, all things which are absolutely devastating in all of the countries where you have these projects. And that is the reason why corruption is so harmful. I mean, in the World Bank estimates that about $1,000 billion is spent every year on corrupt deals. $1,000 billion, and I'm saying this is a small amount of money because the real damage is much greater because of the perverted economic decision-making in many of the third world countries.
No wonder that you are using the word devastating there. There's a huge sum of money. There's an expression that the German language and the English language share, which is that time heals all wounds. Is that true?
Probably. I mean, there are maybe certain wounds which you don't want to heal because you cherish the memory of these painful things which you have experienced. But overall, yes, I think it's a good saying. I have to say, in my case, of course, the death of my first wife was quite different. I mean, she didn't suddenly fall down and was dead.
Of course, no.
But we found out in Prague at a anti-corruption conference in 2001 that she had cancer of the pancreas, and so she was a doctor and also a musician. So she knew that she would die relatively soon. And therefore, we basically moved to Berlin. At that time, we used to live in Washington still. We moved to Berlin, and my children, who all live in the United States with my grandchildren and their families, they all came to Berlin, and they spent a lot of time with both of us. And somehow for us, this became a very intensive sort of 6, 7, 8 months of joint experience. And I must say, looking back, it may sound a little bit little bit frivolous, but it is nearly sort of a festive memory which I have.
I can understand.
And so very often when we had visitors, for instance, who were crying when they came into our house, they left laughing, because my wife spoke with them with great strength and positive spirit. So, I mean, for us, she is still around. I have the feeling that my children and my grandchildren who witnessed her death over these months, that they also made peace with it. Perhaps not all of them in the same way, but for me it was quite natural to live with this loss, and it's a tremendous loss, of course. But after 2 years, I was able to marry Gesine Schwan, and my wife is my wife Jutta. She is still in many ways around.
That's incredible. I'm very grateful for you sharing that with us. I have gone back in the notes that I made when we were talking earlier about the role that your first wife Jutta played in making you the person you are in that phase of your life. I found a remarkable quote, and it must be you who is talking here. And I'd just like to, because an appreciation of who she was. She was always more natural and more concrete than me. A passionate person, an artist, you said. She simply couldn't bear to sit in an elegant car and drive by while an old woman would be carrying a heavy load of wood or children. We always had to stop and give them a lift. She's a woman after my own heart. I must say, when I was a young, a teenager on the streets of the north of England growing up, and I would see elderly people walking along the streets and young people in cars, I would always try and work out how that could be.
Of course, this was particularly stark, this problem, in Nairobi, where I was the director of the World Bank office. And I had sort of a status a bit like an ambassador. So I was driving in a chauffeur-driven car, and we are living in a beautiful, wonderful house. We had a huge office. I had 120 staff members there from the World Bank. So in many ways, for me, it was necessary to look more in a holistic way at the system of the problem. What can you do to improve the health sector? Do you have cost recovery? Do you have to pay doctors more? Do you have to pay them less? Do you have free pharmaceutical products? Do you build fancy hospitals in the city, or do you build little health clinics out in the villages and so on? So this was sort of my field. While Jutta always went out every morning, at 7 o'clock, she took her little car and went out into a clinic of what was called the health services. It was part of the Jamia Mosque, so it was a Muslim health service. And they had clinics in various parts of Nairobi. And she would come home in the evening, tired but happy, and would say, look, I saw 80 patients today. So what did you do? You discussed with your experts, or with the Minister of Health, or with some parastatal boss, about how to improve the world. But in reality, you didn't really help much.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those thoughts with us. Peter Eigen has just been telling me that you go out you have a favourite jazz club in Berlin.
Well, not a club, it's a pub. Where my friends play. And I know that whenever I go there, then they ask me, do you have your horn with you? And when I say yes, then they send me out to the parking lot to get my tenor saxophone. And then I play with them. Because it's much more fun to play than to listen, to be honest.
And you have a long tradition with this, because you had a Dixie band?
Yes,
when
as
you
a student,
a lad, when you were 17, 18 years old?
That's right, that's right.
And you had your own club, and there we have it. We have a photo of the club, yeah?
That's right, that is Der Strohhalm. And I remember that was my first Dixieland band.
And this is down in Erlangen in Bavaria.
It's in Erlangen.
In the north of Bavaria.
In fact, Elke Sommer gave us the piano, which is there as a gift. So it was the first piano we had.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And you've brought one of your instruments along for us, yeah? Just tell us a little bit about the instrument. And
Well, it's an A clarinet, which has been built by a very famous clarinet maker. His name is Gressel. And in fact, his shop is totally reconstructed in the Germanische Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg.
Oh, the German National Museum in Nuremberg, yeah? So you can see the whole workshop.
You see his workshop because he worked on this and his son worked on it. He made this clarinet about 100 years ago. And his son made a B clarinet, which I have at home. And I mean, these are wonderful instruments. And in fact, there's something a bit tragical about this clarinet here, because it was the clarinet of my teacher, Gerhard Grund. And when he noticed that he was getting so much arthritis on his fingers that he couldn't play anymore, he sold it to me. And the next day he killed himself.
Because
he knew that his professional life as a musician
was over.
Yeah.
That's a sad, sad story. And his fingers moved across this instrument.
Yeah, for a long time.
You're going to play for us now with the very same instrument, yeah?
Yeah.
What are you going to play for us?
I think I'll just improvise a little bit.
You're going to improvise a little bit?
Yeah. Well, there's one little waltz which is played by Coltrane, which is called My Favorite Things. And you may recognize it.
Wonderful, wonderful. What a choice, yes. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah. Peter Eigen playing for us here in the studio. Absolutely wonderful. Tell me this, as somebody who has had a passion for jazz for so long, is jazz the music of the past or the music of the future?
Well, it had different meanings in different periods of time and different societies. I mean, it was clearly the music of liberation and of also integration and self-assertion of Black America. Then it sort of migrated. After 45, for instance, when it came to Germany, for us it was sort of a symbol of free America, the free West. And when we all set up jazz clubs and played in Dixieland bands and were proud if we could get an American soldier to play with us and so on, this was again liberation. And but then it moves. I mean, in America, it became quickly swing, it became modern jazz, it became free jazz at a time when we were still playing in Dixieland here in Germany. And I noticed this when I made my first trip to America as a Fulbright student, that my idea of jazz, Dixieland, was considered to be just outlandish. It was like somebody playing polka here in Germany. So I basically gave up my clarinet, but then it came back in the form of a saxophone and became modern music. And that modern music moves again through different societies, through different times, and it is a wonderful thing, jazz.
Wonderful stuff. Thank you very, very much for that, and thank you for everything else, sharing all so much with us today. That is, I'm afraid, your lot with the committed clarinetist Peter Eigen. There's more Talking Germany, including my blog and our archive on the website. If you've enjoyed today's show as much as I have with Peter Eigen, then do come back next week. Until then, bye-bye and tschüss.